The envelope was already open when Dr. Phil walked back onto the stage. His producer had handed it to him in the hallway, 30 seconds before cameras resumed rolling. He'd read the results. Read them twice. And for the first time in over 2 decades of doing this show, he didn't know how to begin. He stood at the edge of the stage. Looked at the 2 people sitting in the guest chairs. A woman named Claire, 38 years old, who'd spent the last 7 years searching for the brother she'd never known existed. And a man named Daniel, 42, who'd grown up an only child and had come on the show only because his wife had convinced him it might explain the medical history gaps that had haunted his family for years. They didn't know each other. That's what everyone believed, but the envelope said otherwise. Claire had been placed for adoption at birth. A closed adoption. Sealed records. The kind of bureaucratic wall that keeps families apart for decades. She'd found out about her biological family only 3 years ago, when her adoptive mother, on her deathbed, had handed her a folded piece of paper with a single name on it. Not an address. Not a phone number. Just a name. And the words, "You have a brother. I'm sorry I never told you." 3 years of searching. Dead ends. False leads. A DNA database that kept returning no matches. And then, 6 months ago, a partial match. Not conclusive. But close enough to follow. The trail had led here. To this studio. To this show. To this man named Daniel who had no idea why he'd really been asked to come. Dr. Phil had structured the episode carefully. Claire's story first. Her search. Her grief. The years of wondering. Then Daniel's segment, his medical questions, his curiosity about his own history. The plan was to build slowly. Reveal the connection gradually. Let the DNA results be the climax. But plans change when reality intervenes. Because 20 minutes into the taping, before the results had been mentioned, before anyone had connected the dots on camera, Claire had said something that stopped everything. Dr. Phil paused mid-sentence. The studio went completely silent. "Wait," Dr. Phil said, his voice dropping. He held up one hand. The gesture that every producer knew meant, stop everything. "Claire. Say that again. Say exactly what you just said." Claire looked confused. She'd been talking about her search. About the years of looking. About the moments that had almost broken her. She rewound in her mind. "I said the closest I ever got was this man I met at a grief support group. About 4 years ago. He was there for the same reason I was, trying to understand a family history he'd never had access to. We talked for almost 2 hours. He gave me his card. I still have it. I never called him because..." She paused. Her eyes drifted to Daniel. Something flickered across her face. Uncertainty. Recognition. Because life got in the way. Dr. Phil turned slowly to Daniel. "Daniel. 4 years ago. Grief support group. Does that mean anything to you?" Daniel's face had gone very still. The kind of still that happens when your brain is processing something your body already knows. I went to a group like that. After my father died. I was looking for information about his side of the family because he'd always been vague about." He stopped. His eyes moved to Claire. Really looked at her. For the first time since they'd both sat down. "I talked to a woman there. For a long time. She was..." His voice dropped to almost nothing. "She was searching for something too. The studio wasn't breathing. I gave her my card," Daniel said. "She never called." Claire's hand moved slowly to her bag. She unzipped it, reached inside, and pulled out a business card. Worn at the edges. The kind of worn that comes from being handled many times. Being looked at. Being held up against hope, and then put back down. She turned it over. Read the name. Looked up at Daniel. "Marcus Daniel Reeves," she said quietly. Daniel nodded once. "That's me. I go by Daniel." Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. He stood up. turned to his production team. Cut the feed. Internal only. Right now. The broadcast cameras kept rolling. This was television, after all, but the live stream was paused. The audience in the studio sat frozen, unsure what was happening. Dr. Phil walked the few steps between his chair and the two guests. Crouched down. Eye level with both of them. Before we do this on camera, he said, his voice low and steady, I need you both to understand what's in this envelope. And I need you to decide together whether you want to open it here, in front of everyone, or privately. Because what's in here is going to change everything. And you deserve to choose how that happens. Claire looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Claire. Two strangers who had sat in a grief support group 4 years ago and talked for 2 hours without knowing they were already exactly what the other was looking for. Open it, Claire said. Daniel nodded. Open it. Dr. Phil stood. Walked back to his chair. Gestured to production. The feed resumed. The audience leaned forward as one organism. 300 people holding a single collective breath. I have the results of the DNA test that both Claire and Daniel submitted 6 weeks ago, Dr. Phil said. His voice was professional. Controlled. But anyone who'd watched the show for years could see it. The slight tightening around his eyes. The extra beat before he continued. These results are definitive. There is no margin of error. He held up the envelope. Claire. Daniel. You are full biological siblings. Same mother. Same father. There is a 99.97% probability of a full sibling relationship. The studio erupted. Not with applause. With sound. Raw, unfiltered human sound. Gasps. Sobs. Someone in the back row saying, "Oh my God!" loud enough to be picked up on mic. Claire had both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. Daniel was perfectly still for 3 full seconds, the kind of stillness that precedes an earthquake, and then something cracked open in his face. Something that had been locked for 42 years. He reached across the space between their chairs. Claire took his hand. That was all. Just hands. Holding. In a television studio. In front of 300 people. After 4 years of having the answer within reach and not knowing it, subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Dr. Phil let the moment exist. Didn't rush it. Didn't redirect. Didn't fill the silence with commentary. Just let two people sit with the enormity of what had just happened. The cameras stayed on their faces. On their hands. On the space between them that had suddenly, finally closed. When Claire finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. 4 years ago. We sat together for 2 hours. I told you things I'd never told anyone. About what it felt like to not know where you came from. I remember, Daniel said. His voice was rough. I remember thinking, this woman understands something that nobody else in my life has ever understood. Because I was looking for you, Claire said. I just didn't know it yet. Daniel looked at their joined hands. Turned the business card over in his other hand. Claire had given it back to him without thinking, and he was holding it like a talisman. Like evidence. Like proof that the universe had been trying to close this distance for years, leaving breadcrumbs either of them had known how to follow. I kept thinking about that conversation, he said, for months afterward. I thought about calling you, tracking down the woman from the group. But I didn't have your information and you never called, and I figured. He exhaled. I figured it was just one of those connections that stays incomplete. But what happened next is something no one in the room, or watching at home, saw coming. Dr. Phil reached into his jacket pocket. Pulled out something small. A photograph. Printed on standard paper, slightly creased. He'd received it from the DNA testing company along with the results, a photo submitted as part of the ancestral history documentation. He held it up. This was submitted with your biological family's records. It was the only photograph on file. It showed a young woman, maybe 25, standing in front of a house neither Claire nor Daniel recognized. She was smiling. And she looked, unmistakably, heartbreakingly, like both of them. "Your biological mother," Dr. Phil said quietly. "Her name was Rose. She passed away 11 years ago. She spent the last years of her life trying to find both of you through the adoption registry. She never stopped looking." Claire made a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite anything else. It was the sound of decades of questions collapsing into a single answer. Daniel took the photograph carefully. Held it so Claire could see it too. They looked at it together. This woman they had never met. Who had looked for them until she couldn't look anymore. "She knew about both of you," Dr. Phil continued, his voice gentle but direct. "The record shows she registered with 3 different reunion databases. She submitted her DNA twice. The timing just..." He paused. "The timing didn't align. You both registered after she passed." The audience was silent. The kind of silence that a studio audience almost never achieves. Not the silence of boredom or confusion, but the silence of witnessing something too real for reaction. Daniel set the photograph carefully on the table between him and Claire. Neither of them let go of the other's hand. "She was looking for us," Claire said. Not a question. Just the fact of it, spoken aloud. Made real by being spoken. "She never stopped," Dr. Phil confirmed. What followed was not television in any traditional sense. There were no more structured questions. No more format. Dr. Phil simply sat with them. Asked small things. Let them talk to each other more than they talked to him. Let them begin, in real time, the impossible process of becoming family to someone who had always been family. Daniel learned that Claire lived 40 minutes from his house. That she had 2 children, a girl and a boy, who were his niece and nephew. That she worked as a nurse, which explains something he'd always felt drawn to without understanding why. He was a paramedic. That she had their mother's eyes, which he could see now that he was looking, which he could see now that he knew. Claire learned that Daniel had their mother's stubbornness. That he'd been to the same grief support group not once but 6 times, always hoping to run into the woman from the first session again, never finding her. That he had a scar on his left hand from a childhood accident that matched, almost exactly, a scar on Claire's right hand. Different hands, different accidents, different childhoods, same genetic tendency toward the same kind of recklessness. Dr. Phil watched them find each other. Really find each other, not just acknowledge the DNA result but begin the actual work of recognition. Of seeing the familiar in someone you've just met. It was the rarest thing he ever witnessed in that studio. Not the dramatic revelation, those happened. But this, the quiet, incremental discovery of shared selfhood. The way a stranger becomes a mirror. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the taping, Dr. Phil sat in his dressing room for a long time. Held the business card that Claire had eventually given back to Daniel, who had given it to Dr. Phil as a kind of offering, proof of what almost didn't happen. What 4 years of proximity had failed to accomplish that one envelope had finally achieved. He kept the card. Put it in the drawer of his desk, where he kept the things that reminded him why the show existed. Not for ratings. Not for drama. For moments like this one. Where the right question, asked at the right time, in the right room, collapsed years of distance into a single afternoon. Claire and Daniel left the studio together. Walked out to the parking lot side by side. Made plans for dinner that same evening. Claire called her children on the way to her car to tell them they had an uncle. Daniel sat in his truck for 20 minutes before he could drive, holding the photograph of the mother who had never stopped searching. They visited Rose's grave together the following weekend. Brought flowers. Stood on either side of the headstone. Said her name out loud. Told her they'd found each other. Told her they were sorry it had taken so long. The business card, Marcus Daniel Reeves, paramedic, County Emergency Services, eventually found its way into a frame. Claire hung it in her hallway, next to a photograph taken at that first dinner. Her family, his family, one table. The card that had been carried for 4 years without being used. The connection that had been waiting in a pocket, in a wallet, in a drawer, for the moment it was finally understood. Some things find their way. Not quickly. Not easily. But eventually. With enough time, enough searching, enough refusal to stop believing that the person you're looking for is still out there. Eventually, the distance closes. Rose had known that. Had spent her last years proving it. And in a television studio in Los Angeles, her children finally proved it too. Some families are separated by circumstance. But they find each other. Always. Even when it takes 40 years, a grief support group, a business card that never got used, and one envelope that changed everything. Rose was right to keep searching. She just didn't know her children were already doing it for her.